of each of our hearts, directing them to a perfect understanding of your love, your care, your presence for us. We pray all of this in Christ's name. Amen. Grace and peace be to each, to all, from God our Creator and the Lord Jesus Christ. My dear friends, I omitted one announcement I had intended to make this morning, and that is next Sunday, March the 15th. In addition to the other events here, Lorene Valls is coming to play in worship. She and her husband Joe will be moving to Wausau shortly. I believe mid-April they're making that move. And we've asked Lorene if she would come back and share with us the wonderful gift of music that she has. So accompanied by Mark Schubert, she will be playing the flute next Sunday morning. And I hope as many of us as possible can be here. Also to bid her a farewell and to wish her God's blessings as she and Joe take next steps on their journey. Beth and I have been privileged to do some traveling in our life, and most of it has been funded by the willingness of many of our church members to travel with us. You know how that works. If you are the one who will serve as the guide for a tour, if you have 10 people go with you, there are a certain amount of dollars off your fee for the trip. If you have 20 people go, well, serving a church of 2,000 people, you see, if we needed to get 36 people to go on a trip, it was never a major job. Indeed, most of the time we would have 50 or 60 people, did some wonderful traveling. Did the Rhine River, the Danube River. We were to the wonderful festival in Germany, the reenactment of the life of Jesus. Every 10 years, and only once every 10 years is it done. Oberammergau. What a wonderful place it was. So we have always said an extra word of thank you to our parishioners who have said that we want to travel. Will you guide us? Will you lead us? You know, on every one of those trips, I have seen more castles than I ever wanted to see. That's how they talk about it over there. We're going to see another castle. Not a castle. It's a castle. And we also have seen lots of church structures. Almost like the temple defined in the lesson from John this morning. I remember sitting in some of those temples. There was one church, one large church we went to see, where all of their former pastors were embalmed and placed in glass enclosures around the outside of the sanctuary, in little chapel or chaplet inlets. Don't get any idea. And I can remember also we tried to take photographs. And you know what? None of us could get a photograph to turn out that would show us the remains of that pastor. All we got was clear glass. Don't understand it. But I can tell you, we sure tried hard to get a photograph. There were other times I would sit in the back row of those large cathedrals and wonder why this was part of our tour, and wonder why so many people would come through the doors of that sanctuary, that cathedral, and what their reasons were being there. It was a wonderful place for people to watch. But let me tell you, in the midst of one trip, I sat in this large Catholic church. The Stations of the Cross ran down one side of the sanctuary. At the front, over the communion table, there's a painting of Jesus with a crippled boy. a woman carrying a baby, an elderly man on the ground, all begging for help. And then I watched the people who came in. I watched the folks go and touch the holy water. I watched one teenager wash the back of his neck with holy water. I watched some poorly dressed persons quietly asking for money, and some outside the cathedral doors not quietly asking for money, but demanding money. I remember in one of those cathedrals watching a young woman bring her small child with her to pray. I remember hearing an older man around me who was speaking desperately and whispering to God his needs in life. Now, as part of that tour, and not wanting to intrude on the members of that church, most of us stayed in the back. But I remember two elderly women who just marched down the center aisle, straight to the front, as if they had a meeting with the president scheduled. They kneeled, they prayed for just a minute, and left to see, I'm sure, if God was going to do what they had demanded. I remember another woman there, maybe in her 40s, early 50s, who just kneeled and looked straight ahead. She had a handkerchief, and every minute or so, she would wipe the tears off her face. If she had been in our church, I would have probably gone and said, are you all right? But being in another country, not knowing the mother tongue effectively, I could only stand and watch. Thinking about what possible reasons there could be for her to be there in that moment, praying and crying. Had she just lost her job? Was her marriage coming apart? Was her child sick? What was it that caused her to be there? Maybe she was one of those saints that carried the sufferings of the world, that weeps with God. And in light of that traveling, in light of experiences like that, I begin to reflect more and more about those things in our world about which we don't weep and we're not very attentive. I recently saw a report from the United Nations, and they were talking about major wars in our lifetime. They define a major war as any military conflict inflicting 1,000 battlefield deaths in a year. And then they said there are about 15 major wars ongoing in our world right now. According to one estimate in the report, 191,000 people have died in the conflict in Syria. Most of us haven't cried any tears over them. Today, in this 24-hour period of which we are part, 25,000 people, 3/4 of them who are children, will die of hunger. We have more than enough reasons to come here to pray, to worship, to cry, yes, and to find some deep and abiding joy. Coming to church is not just making us feel good about ourselves. Coming to church is finding what we need to do with the lives we have yet to live. Jesus never lived in a period of peacefulness in all 35 of his years. Yes, I said 35. I know the common culture is that Jesus was 33. He was born in 6 BC. He was crucified in 29 AD. During Jesus' lifetime, he experienced terrible, terrible violence and suffering. Not just in his own crucifixion, the trial, the crucifixion, and his death. Indeed, the town next to Nazareth, where Jesus lived, when he was 11 years old, there was a rebellion there. And the rebels in that rebellion against the Roman military raided a royal armory at Sepphoris, about 4 miles from where Jesus lived. The Roman vengeance was swift and sudden. The city of Sepphoris was burned to the ground. Its inhabitants were sold into slavery. 2,000 Jewish rebels were crucified on crosses set in a line along the main road to warn others tempted to participate in the rebellion. There is much in our world, friends, that brings us to the point of overwhelming grief, uncertainty, and wonder if this world will ever find the purposes of God. Which brings us back to those who are in the sanctuary this morning. When we were in Hartford, there was a wonderful lady, beautiful, articulate. Her name was Dougie. That was her given name. Mom and Dad wanted to have a son. So they named their daughter Dougie. How did that smile? Dougie was a proponent of what she called random acts of kindness. She said, no day is complete without you engaging, you performing in random acts of kindness that no one is anticipating or expecting, but you choose to do to model the Christian way of life. Sometimes that random act of kindness is with the person with whom you live. Sometimes that random act of kindness is to reach out in another way to a person who perhaps sits with handkerchief and simply cries. A hand, a touch, something to change. As a matter of fact, Dougie wanted us to put a sign on the back balcony of the church that when people would leave, they would see that sign, and the sign would say, now the worship really begins. Any of you ever heard the name Charles Dewey? I want to tell you about a random act of kindness with Charles Dewey. I bet you if I ask how many people have Apple gadgets in this congregation, I'd get a pretty good return. An iPhone, an iPad. Well, this Charles Dewey loved his Apple, but he discovered how those Apple iPads were made. Since almost everything that Apple does is made in China. He did some investigative reporting. He found horrendous working conditions in the Chinese factories where all of Apple's wares were made. For the princely sum of $17 a day, Chinese line workers put in 10-hour workdays plus an additional 2 hours a day of work maintaining the factory, where they also slept. The workers slept in company dormitories, which crammed 7 to 10 people in a room. Dewey found that working conditions were at best Spartan and at worst unsafe. Living conditions ranged from simply miserable to completely unsanitary. Charles Dewey against the mighty fortress of Apple. And his random act of kindness for those workers has caused Apple to make major changes in monitoring how the workers are treated and the benefits that they receive. Well, how many of us can have an effect on workers in China? Let's talk about the rural poor in the Holy Land. It's the same thing. Some folks from the Women's Guild here at St. Paul's Church, this little church of approximately 100 members, what can they do to change the culture of an entire community? They said no one is going to be hungry in this community any longer. And we're going to create a food pantry that will meet the needs of any family here. You know, I can almost see that sign up there. Now the worship really begins. We come here to identify, to meditate, to consider, and then we go out to do the right thing. Whether we call it a random act of kindness or an act of kindness that changes our world, I simply want to say to you during this Lenten period, in the shadow of this wonderful story of Jesus cleansing the temple, of the wonderful wisdom that has been entrusted to us that is foolishness in the eyes of much of the world. We can change the community in which we live, in which we breathe. We can make an incredible difference. But we must understand the urgency of it all. You know how many deals I've made with the Lord? Lots of deals. Oh, and it goes beyond, Lord, get me out of this one, I'll never do it again. It goes even further than that. Lord, you know, there's going to come a time when I'm going to have more time. I'm not going to be quite so busy. And when I get to that point, I'll do something really substantial for you, Lord. And then we die. There is an urgency in worship. There is an urgency in our doing something to change the world in which we live. And during Lent, we are asked to consider what that marvelous work may be. And it could be. It's just a random act of kindness. Ministering to you all in Christ's name. Amen.